Jamil, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask if you'll just start with some introductory comments until about 2:15, and tell us a little bit about generally war in the Constitution, and then if you want to talk a little bit about Ukraine, that would be great too.
Sure. Well, Kathy, thanks to you and the team for having me on board. I'm thrilled to be part of Constituting America. I'm thrilled to be part of the effort that you all and Janine have launched together, and thrilled to get questions from your student questioners, from Haley, from Jordan and Jewel. So I'm really excited about this. It's going to be a great conversation. So I thought what I'd do, if it's all right, is to sort of set out some of the basic constitutional framework around how we think about war and conflict, because as we know, there is a war going on today in Ukraine. Russia invaded Ukraine about 2 years ago now, in 2022. And the United States, whether you support it or not, whatever you might think about it, is currently engaged in sending a significant amount of military equipment, training, and the like to Ukraine in its effort to help get Russia out of its country. So there's a war going on, and we're engaged at some level. We're not necessarily involved in the fighting. Our troops aren't on the battlefield, but they're nearby. They're training Ukrainians in other countries in the region. And a lot of our military equipment and billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, are going to this fight against the Russians in the hands of Ukrainians to fight that conflict. So we should talk about what that means under the U.S. Constitution. So starting right at the top, right, we think about who has the authority under our Constitution to declare war, to announce that a war is ongoing, and to put the United States in a state of war. You might be surprised to know that our framers decided to put that in the hands of Congress, that the power to declare war is in the hands of Congress. It's in Article 1 of the Constitution, and it's a specifically assigned power. If you guys remember, in your constitutional classes, you've been told that our legislature, our Congress, is a body of specific enumerated powers. And they're the powers laid out in the Constitution. One of those powers is the power to declare war. Number of other powers given to Congress when it comes to foreign policy, national security, and our war-making structure, right? For example, Congress has the power to provide for an army and a navy, the army and the navy of the United States. They also have the authority to provide funding and resources for all manner of things in the U.S. government, to impose taxes and to then spend that money. That power, the spending power, is in the hands of the elected representatives in Congress, your 2 senators from your state, and then your congressperson and all 435 members of the House of Representatives as well. A number of other powers, the power to make rules about the land and naval forces, the power to put in place the laws of nations and to make those our laws. All that is in the powers of your in the hands of the elected representative of Congress, specifically the enumerated powers in the Constitution. There are a lot of powers, though, as well in the hands of the president. The president's authorities under the Constitution are much shorter. They're in Article 2 of the Constitution. It's just a few paragraphs long. But the Constitution says, one, that the president shall have the executive power. So unlike the enumerated powers of Congress, the president has something that's called the executive power. It's not really clear what the Constitution means. Some people say that if you have to look back to the days of from where our Constitution came, the kings of yore. But remember, when we created our constitutional republic, we also got rid of kings. And so the president is not a king, but he has this power that derives from some of the earlier powers that were thought to be in the state corporately, back in the country we came from, back in the United Kingdom, and that European constitutional structure we came from. The president also, under the Constitution, is the commander-in-chief of those same Army and Navy, the armed naval forces of the United States. And so as commander-in-chief, it's understood the president has the ability to direct the military forces if and when they're called upon in service to the United States, and the military of the several states, the militias of the several states, if, when, and called into the actual service to the United States. So the president is the leader of those armed forces. Now, in terms of historical tradition, right, the president has traditionally had a lot more involvement and influence in international affairs and engaging in conflict. In fact, the United States hasn't declared war formally through the congressional process since the 1940s during World War II. And yet we've been in all manner of things that we call wars: the war in Korea, right? The Vietnam War. We've been in the two wars in the Persian Gulf, right? The two Iraq wars. We've been involved in global war on terror since 2001, when Al Qaeda struck us here, killing nearly 3,000 Americans in one fell swoop in New York City and here at the Pentagon, and on Flight United 93 that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And so we've been in all sorts of conflicts around the globe without Congress formally declaring war. Now, Congress did take action in a lot of those conflicts. At times, Congress provided what they call an authorization for the use of military force that says we're authorized the president to use military force, not a formal declaration of war in the Constitution, but something approaching that. Congress has funded conflicts as well. And Congress has at times used the draft to call up ordinary Americans who did not choose to voluntarily serve in the military to be forced to serve in the military during a time of war, both in Korea as well as in Vietnam. And so Congress has taken action, but hasn't declared war formally since the 1940s. So we should talk about what all that means for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And then, as in the couple of minutes that I have remaining, I want to just mention a couple of things about Ukraine. It's worth remembering that Ukraine wasn't always an independent country. Back in the 80s and 90s, and prior to that, it was part of the Soviet Union. It was a republic of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Ukraine and a number of other Soviet republics became independent. Now, Ukraine, interestingly, as one of these former Soviet republics, had a number of nuclear weapons on its soil. A lot of Soviet nuclear weapons were on its soil. And as part of its independence, it returned those nuclear weapons to what became Russia, traditional Russia. And as part of that, the Russians and the United States and a number of other nations came together and said, because Ukraine is giving up these nuclear weapons and returning them to Russia proper, we're going to all agree to guarantee its territorial integrity. We're going to guarantee its sovereignty. We're going to guarantee its borders. Well, we've seen the Russians violate that guarantee a number of times. That was called the Budapest Memorandum. It was an agreement between all these countries coming together saying we're going to guarantee Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for giving up these nuclear weapons. Russia, of course, in 2014 invaded Ukraine, took Crimea. And now in 2022, just a couple of years ago, they once again invaded Ukraine, sought to take some of those eastern provinces, saying that there are these Russian-speaking peoples who are not being treated fairly, and then marched almost all the way to Ukraine's capital, trying to take back Ukraine. Ukraine pushed back. And now here we are in what largely appears to be a frozen conflict, with the U.S. pouring in billions of dollars and a lot of supplies, as well as our allies in Europe as well, less than we have, but a significant amount as well. And the Ukraine's fighting back to keep their country. So that's what we're talking about today. That's the topic we have before us. That's a little bit of the constitutional background. Back over to you, Kathy.
Well, thank you so much. That was a great overview, and just really appreciate the outlining the powers of war in the Constitution and the history on Ukraine. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Janine.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Jaffer. That was really wonderful, and I thank you for your fabulous service to our country. And what a prestigious guest you are to be with us today, and we're lucky. So thank you very, very much. All right, so I'm going to back up a little. I thought, gosh, my mind, as you were speaking, I was like, oh yeah, that, and I didn't write any of it down. But I want to talk about the Constitution and a few things to clarify that. But before we do, briefly, and I only have like 10 minutes here and that to pass. The Budapest Memorandum, I think that's what you called it. That's really interesting to me because, and I'd heard that Ukraine had nuclear weapons, and under the Clinton administration, they had to give them, they surrendered those weapons, and that we said, the coalition was formed that they would be protected. I didn't know they were Russia's weapons actually in their territory that they were giving back. That's also interesting. It's just, I have to tell you, we learn everything in sound bites. And to be able to have this discussion is just of paramount importance. And I hope we can impress upon our rising generations to dig more deeply, because decisions are made on knee-jerk headlines instead of getting down into the nitty-gritty of things, such as it was, they were Russia's nuclear arms to begin with. But the Budapest Memorandum, is that what it was called? Now, should that not have been one of my pet peeves with the Constitution is Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, that these memorandums that are made, whatnot, are really treaties. And they call them by different names or executive agreement, things of that nature, and thus they don't have to be ratified by the Senate. So can you just briefly tell us a little bit about that Budapest memorandum, but also why wasn't that wouldn't that really be a treaty of sorts?
Yeah, it's a great question. This question of, the Constitution only talks about one kind of international agreement, and that's treaties. Now, treaties are agreements between two nations where they formalize that agreement, they write it down, and then the U.S. and the other country has to go through its own process. But in the U.S., the president negotiates a treaty, and then the Senate, not the House and Senate together, but just the Senate under the Constitution provides what's called its advice and consent. Now, in the early days of the Republic, George Washington thought advice meant I go to talk to Congress, I hear what they want to hear about in this treaty, then I go negotiate, and then I come back and they say yes. Well, the first time he did that, it went really poorly. He got a lot of advice, and ultimately Congress said, you know what, we're just going to refer the advice to a committee. Washington was very upset. He walked out and swore never to come back and get their advice ahead of time. He said, I'm going to come back after the fact, and every president since then has said, I'm going to come to Congress after I negotiate a treaty. I'm going to say, hey, you can advise on it. You can give me your yes or no. You can make changes if you want, but then if you make changes, I've got to go back and work with the other side on that. So that's the treaty process. Now, the Constitution doesn't contemplate any other international agreements other than treaties, and yet, ever since the early days of the Republic, going back to George Washington, his era, and even the pre-constitutional republic, the United States has engaged in dozens and dozens, in fact, thousands of international agreements that aren't quote unquote treaties. So then you might say to yourself, well, how do I know whether something should be a treaty or shouldn't be a treaty? Who gets to decide? What happens if somebody decides it's not going to be a treaty, but I want it to be a treaty? Can I make it a treaty? Can I force us to go through this process? And the way it turns out this has played out over the 250 some years we've been a nation is that the presidents have basically sort of, worked with the Senate to come up with a sort of list of things that are generally treaty subjects, things like nuclear weapons, right? And how many nuclear weapons we have, right? Agreements about mutual defense pacts, right? Those are the kind of things that are traditionally thought of as treaties. Other things are not traditionally thought of as treaties. And so the president has some authority to do those on his own through these executive agreements, through congressional executive agreements where Congress will authorize it. And then the House and the Senate can weigh in together, not separately, not just the Senate. And so there are all these weird things. But you're right. As a general matter, our constitutional order is treaties, period, full stop. That just hasn't been how it's worked over 200 years. And now you see, what some might say are abuses or going too far. And, we saw the Iran nuclear agreement, which was about nuclear weapons, but wasn't about reducing the level of our nuclear weapons. So the president there said, I can do it through an executive agreement, not even a signed agreement, just a something written down on paper, a set of bullet points, right? A joint plan of action. Congress got very upset and said, no, you can't. We're going to step in the way of that. We're going to make sure we get to at least review it. But then some people said, well, why wasn't it a treaty? Well, the president submitted as such. And then the question, and I'll leave it here, Janine, is what can Congress do about it if they want something to be a treaty? Well, they can withdraw the funding. They can say, we're not going to allow you to pay for that thing, right? We're going to bar it, right? But remember, if they say we're not going to fund it, we're going to bar it, what's going to happen? They've got to do that in law. The House and the Senate have to agree. They have to get at least 60 votes in the Senate to end debate. Then it has to go to the president. The president, presumably, if he cares a lot or he or she cares a lot about it, they'll veto it. Then you need supermajorities in the House and the Senate to stand by that. So 2/3 of the House and Senate have to agree. If you have the kind of bipartisan majorities we've seen in both houses, very hard to get 2/3 agree on anything, much less stay in the way of the president's way on a key foreign policy objective he or she might have.
Wonderful answer. Yeah, well, I'm one of those that says it should all run through the Senate and there shouldn't be these partial bullet point, sneaky little documents that that we're giving one man or one woman someday, the power to go make those decisions. I don't think that was ever, there's no check. There's no check if you can get around these treaties. And I was thinking about the one that we had recently that dealt with weapons surreptitiously, so to speak, with Iran. Okay, well, let's move on very quickly. And so this is a very quick 10-second answer. The draft, if there has to be a draft, Congress does that?
Congress have to authorize the draft. That's correct.
They authorize the draft. Okay.
Correct.
The other thing that I think is of note is I love the way the check, the where Congress has to fund it, which is sort of what's happening now. They're saying we're not going to pass this funding Ukraine or Israel until we deal with the border. I think it's really interesting that we're really seeing a check come into play currently right now. What just define, see, in my mind, with the Constitution, the Congress holds so much power because they declare war and they hold the purse. But the president, as you said, since World War II, every war that we've been having a part in all these other wars, we're really done by the president. And that declared by the president, that's through the War Powers Act, is it not? And can you talk about that War Powers Act? Because I think it's controversial in a way. It was really meant to stop the president from having so much power during the Vietnam War, but in a way, it gives the president power to declare whatever war he wants, or she. And I think that when did that start? And that wasn't that sort of the genesis of a lot of power for the president in war?
Well, so it turns out that the War Powers Resolution, which was passed in the late 1970s, early 80s, to constrain the president after Vietnam, you're exactly right. The idea was that the president should not be allowed to put U.S. military forces in a case where they might engage in hostilities, or if he could, only do it for a limited amount of time without Congress's authorization. So Congress passed this law called the War Powers Resolution. What it basically says is, if the president introduces U.S. armed forces into a potential conflict situation, he has to report to Congress. And if Congress doesn't say yes within a certain amount of days, he has to pull them out. Every president since that was passed has said, I'm going to act consistently with that, but I'm not going to say it's the law. I think that constrains my powers as commander-in-chief. So every president has reported to Congress. They've never withdrawn troops, even though Congress hasn't always authorized them to be there. So it's a point of contention between Congress and the president.
So once they get them there through the War Powers Act, it's very hard to pull them back, sort of like that, majority to veto a president. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly right. But the truth is the president, even prior to War Powers Resolution, could have done it. So all this does is forces him or her to report, and then Congress can try to act and try to remove them. Of course, the problem is once you have troops in the field, nobody in Congress wants to vote against American troops in the field. So the president has a lot of authority, regardless of whether he does it under the War Powers Resolution or not. Once he puts American troops in harm's way, nobody's pulling funding for them unless they want to be criticized deeply at home for abandoning our troops.
I have to toss now, but very quickly, how did he have all that power before the War Powers Act? Because the Congress has to declare, and I really think that that's organically what our founders meant. Congress has to declare, and Congress can fund it. So how suddenly did he have all that power even before the 70s?
Well, the framers were tricky because they made the president commander-in-chief. In addition to giving Congress war powers, they made the president commander-in-chief. So they split it up a little bit. And so the president, even in the early days, the earliest Congresses, the president indicated his authority to go in and conduct military operations, including on our own soil against Indians, without Congress authorizing it. And so there's always been this tension built into our framework. The separation of powers, it isn't always clean. They made it in times in tension in order to create that sort of push and pull between the legislative and executive branches.
Well, I guess the trick would be to make sure the president didn't have any money to go do that.
They could do that. They could pull the funding. Exactly right.
It's like the Pentagon, they're funded, but not for this. Okay, I have to pass. Thank you so much. I can ask a zillion questions.
Thanks,
I'm
Jean.
passing. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Jewel.
Yes, thank you for everything so far. It's a huge topic. So my first question has to do with just the concept of war in the Constitution. What was our I know oftentimes we'll hear our founders were isolationists, or there's different contentions. What was their view? What are we to see the view of war in the Constitution as? I mean, I know it's a big open-ended question, but as fast as you could to answer that.
Well, our framers were obviously concerned that we not get engaged in all sorts of military engagements overseas. They were focused on building a nation here first. They recognized, though, that on our borders, which were, if you remember, a lot smaller in some sense than they are today, in those 13 colonies, they knew we had what we viewed as hostile Indian tribes on the other side of that border. They knew we had nations like the British who were opposed to us being independent. They knew we were going to have to fight wars in our early days. The Revolutionary War was the first one. They knew other wars would come, and they did. The French-Indian Wars came. The Spanish-American War came. So they knew we'd have to get into conflict, but they wanted to make it hard to get into conflict. They wanted the president to have some authority to act and respond to attacks, but they wanted Congress, the people, they wanted the people to weigh in on it. And that's why they had to declare war power in the hands of Congress. It's also, by the way, why they gave Congress the power and ability to tax, and why they gave the power to tax first to the House. Any revenue bills have to start in the House, the people's house.
And their vision of being able to of the president being able to enter into conflict as commander in chief, but then be funded as the Congress, as we talked about, is happening differently today. A lot of, for political motives. Congress is not going to pull troops after they have funding, but also, what was um our standing, that our standing military is obviously bigger and different in modern times. So tell me,
Yeah.
is that part of what the difference between our founders America and our America, having the robust military in place?
Well, certainly having a large military available to the president provides them the ability to put them in more places and do more things. But remember, it's also what's made us very capable as a nation, right? The reason we're the world's leading superpower, and the reason we have so much influence and capability in the world, is because we have a standing military, and our adversaries are afraid of us, and our allies know we're there for them, right? When that decays, in fact, what I would say, Jewel, is the reason we see the world in chaos today is this is what a world looks like when America chooses not to lead. For the last 15, 20 years, under presidents of various parties, we've chosen to step back from the world, focus here at home, and not think about what our adversaries are doing abroad, and not think about what our allies need. And as a result, we have a war going on in Europe, a war going on in the Middle East, a near war in the Taiwan Straits that's going to come. China will come after Taiwan soon, right? This is a world devoid of American leadership. America needs to lead. A strong military intelligence community is part of that, but we need to lead with caution and with vision.
Yeah, it's certainly a good time to have this show, as we are entering into a new age of conflict around the world. It's a little scary. Um, Another quick question. Thank you for answering with so much information, but quickly. Um, when we're looking at sending aid to a foreign nation, and that nation's in war, um, constitutionally, what's our background on that? What's our frame of reference that we should understand?
Yeah. Well, it's not war because we're not directly fighting it, but it's a lot of our weapons and money going in, and we're training those troops. So Congress has got to provide the authority to send that money and to provide that funding. And thus far, Congress has authorized that funding to the tune of billions of dollars. But it's important to remember, by the way, a lot of people think, hey, we're spending all this money in Ukraine, and Ukraine's getting all this money, and it's a free ride. You know what that money is buying? What that money is actually buying is it's buying stocks to replace U.S. weaponry. It's being sent to Ukraine. So we're sending weapons, tanks, ammunition from our stocks, sending to Ukraine. Then we're buying from American producers more weapons for ourselves. And so, yes, it's taxpayer dollars being spent, but it's not just being spent in Ukraine. It's actually being spent here in the United States on American weaponry. Yes, going over there in the fight, but it's American jobs and American factories that are at work creating these weapons.
And then, as we see the support of the foreign nation through aid, though, still, although being done in a way to still help the American economy in one way, is there constitutionally that financial aid to the other, to another nation in conflict? How should we think about that from a founder's mindset, or what does the Constitution say about
Yeah.
that?
Well, the Constitution doesn't directly speak to it, but I think from the founders' perspective, they'd want to be careful. They'd want us to be cautious about not being dragged into the fight, because once you start funding a fight, start providing weapons in, the other side is going to see you as a part and parcel of that conflict, right? What happened in World War I and World War II, Lend-Lease Act, right? We ultimately got drawn into that conflict because we were providing those capabilities, those supplies, even though the country at the time wasn't ready for war. Ultimately, our involvement in both those wars led to successful conflict resolution in our favor. But that's something you've got to be cautious about, and something our framers were very concerned about, us dragged into these overseas adventures.
And also, now a little bit of a bigger question, philosophically. I'm oftentimes I see both sides of the issue with an isolationist mindset versus an interventionist mindset. When you really look at, I just can't bring myself to really believe that if we put up some defenses on our own land, similar to, like, an Israel, that we'd be okay and the rest of the world can um deal with itself. I don't see that as feasible when you look at, so after World War II and Russia's influence in China, and China in the Korea War, and the Vietnam War, gets all of these things get such a bad rap, and today it's very popular um kind of say, oh, look at the mess we made. But on the flip side of that, there's been war throughout all of history. Man is flawed, and our founders' view and the Christian view is that original sin makes us flawed, and we're going to fight for things, and there will be war. Um, our founders did make it hard for us to get into war, but um, I don't see them as being strictly isolationist, and I see their not intervention with the French Revolution partially because they didn't see a direct. They knew we were young. They knew we didn't just have unlimited resources, and they didn't see that the other side of the French Revolution was strictly identifying with the American Revolution. Um, so that is kind of my comment, which you can comment on. In the Ukraine war, no one wants to see Russia just decide one day they're going to take over Ukraine. We believe in borders. We believe in sovereignty, and at this point, Ukraine is a sovereign nation. Why is Russia going to kill civilians and everything else to perpetrate horrible evils on these people and take their land? But in a realistic sense, do we have a clear objective in our aid? Where does it end, and how do we stop the most amount of life loss possible and create stability in the world moving forward?
Look, these are great questions. I think you're exactly right, Jewel. I think that an America that doesn't lean forward and doesn't act in the world is an America that's less safe at home. Our economic and national security depends on us not fighting these wars here in the United States. At every turn, when the United States has turned isolationist and turned inwards, we've been hit. We were attacked in World War II at Pearl Harbor. We were attacked by Al-Qaeda on 9/11. Every time we try to take advantage of it's a safer world environment, now's the time for us to step back. It's when they come after us at home. It is better for us to fight our adversaries overseas. It is better for us to take leadership in the world. And frankly, it's in America's interest, and it's who we are as a nation. We are a nation called to action. We are a city on a hill. We should be proud of that. We should be proud of our role in the world. We should be proud of our democracy. We should stand for that in the world. It doesn't mean we have to be the world's policeman. We should not be the world's policeman. We should expect other nations to take care of themselves. At the same time, when it's in our national interest, we should be unafraid to act overseas, whether that's militarily or economically. And in this case, Russia has been for decades and is today a major adversary. They work with Iran, they work with North Korea, they work with China. These nations are increasingly working together. They repress their own people. They seek to export that repression abroad. They seek to oppose American interests and our allies abroad. We should fight them anywhere they are, and certainly not at home if we can avoid that. And so in a lot of ways, the Ukrainians are fighting for their own country, us defending them, but having a clear objective about that is the right thing to do, in my view. Now, the challenge, of course, has been there's no plan for winning, right? We haven't given them everything they need to win, right? We've been pouring money into this fight over and over. It's now a frozen conflict. If we want them to win, if we want them to win today, we should give them what it takes to make a clear victory, get this thing done, create real objectives, and achieve those objectives. That, I think, is probably the biggest criticism I have of the administration's policy. This is a never-ending war with an unlimited budget. We need to be clear. We think the Ukrainians should win. We're going to give what it takes to win, and we're going to make that happen. This sort of, well, we want them to win a little bit, but not that much, is no real foreign policy and not real success. It's no surprise that people in Congress are skeptical today, and the American people are skeptical today.
Thank you for those answers on giant questions. That was awesome, and I'll pass on to the next host.
Well, thank you, Jewel. Haley?
Yes, ma'am. Firstly, I want to say thank you for joining us today. It really has been very insightful, especially being in college. It's great to hear all these different questions and all these different answers. One of the questions that I have that I've been typing my questions and retyping my questions is there anything conditional about us giving money to Ukraine? Or do you think we're actually sending money, or are we simply just supporting items like weapons and such?
Well, I think this has been part of the challenge, Haley, of this conflict, is that we haven't really, I don't think it's clear to us and to members of Congress and to the administration even what our policy is. Our policy is, yes, we'll support Ukraine. Yes, Russia should get out of Ukraine. Ukraine's territorial integrity should be preserved. But then why didn't we give them long-range missiles early on? Why didn't we give them F-16s early on? Why didn't we give them M1A1 Abrams battle tanks early on? Why we slowly increase our funding and our capabilities into this war? If we really thought they needed all this to win, let's empower them to win. The problem is the administration has the Biden White House has been, well, look, I mean, we want them to succeed somewhat, but if they get too aggressive, well, then the Russians might use nuclear weapons. They might try to drag us into the conflict. So there's been a lot of hand-wringing about this. And again, it's not just the Biden administration. It's not political. This has been true of multiple administrations in the past. We've gotten in these type of situations before. We need clear objectives. We need a clear plan, and then we need to resource that plan with what it takes to win. That hasn't been what we've done here. It's not what we did in prior conflicts. This has been an endemic problem for multiple presidents. We need to get out of that thing. Congress needs to hold the administration to account, this administration and the next one, to account for these kind of things when we get in conflicts overseas.
Mm-hmm. And then I think another thing that especially I'm curious about is, since, as far as I know, we don't have a treaty with Ukraine, what part of our Constitution allows our Congress to be able to give them this money and give them all of this stuff to defend themselves?
Yeah. It's a great question. You're exactly right. We don't have a treaty. This Budapest Memorandum was a political understanding. It was not a treaty through the treaty process, to Janine's point. And it requires Russia to do its part too, which it isn't doing either. And so in some ways that agreement is null and void because Russia has invaded Ukraine and isn't abiding by its obligations. We didn't agree. We didn't sign up to a guarantee that we would defend Ukraine. But what has happened is the president has said he believes it's in our interests to keep Russia out of Ukraine because he's afraid that once they take Ukraine, by the way, I think he's right on this. And I think the members of Congress and Republicans and Democrats who supported the president are right that Russia won't stop at Ukraine. They're looking at Poland. They want to recreate, Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. We cannot let that happen. We can't have a war in the middle of Europe. So fighting this thing is the right thing. Putting weapons into this fight is the right thing to do. But we need a clear objective. Now, how can Congress do that constitutionally? They have the spending power. The president's commander-in-chief, he working with Congress, or she can work with Congress, can do this. They've chosen to do that. It doesn't require a treaty to do it. The question is now that there's a disagreement between Congress and the president about how to pursue this conflict, what happens next?
Right. And I know, especially with our Congress and everything, because if I remember, the last time we got involved and declared a war was World War II.
Right.
So how then do you think our Congress is able to get involved in the Middle East and get involved with Ukraine and assist actively in these wars?
Yeah, I think the way we're doing it thus far is we're not putting U.S. troops in harm's way, right? We don't have a U.S. We have U.S. weapons in the fight, but we don't have U.S. military in the fight. So I think the view is we're not in a military force use situation. But remember, it's worth noting that in the Red Sea right now, we do have American troops deployed in the Red Sea. They are firing back U.S. missiles, shooting down Iranian-backed Houthi drones and missiles. And we just saw the U.S. sink 3 Houthi boats. And so there is an ongoing conflict there. Now, as a general matter, the view of our nation has been over 200 years that the president can respond to attacks on U.S. forces or things that threaten U.S. interests in some limited way. The question is what happens when it becomes a long-term shooting war. We've generally taken the view that Congress has to authorize something, the use of military force. But remember, Haley, if Congress spends money, that can be viewed as sort of a tacit authorization because they know the conflict is going on. They haven't pulled the troops back, and they're spending money to keep those troops there. That might be viewed as tacit endorsement too. It's not the constitutional process, but a lot of presidents have said, look, Congress has authorized money. I'm going to go continue to do this thing. And Congress hasn't stopped them.
Right. Do you think in any way, shape, or form we're going to get that money back in any way? Do you think that Ukraine is going to feel obligated to pay us back in the future with anything?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think Ukraine can afford to pay us back. I don't think they're planning on paying us back. I think the reason we've spent this money is because we saw it in our interest to push Russia out, to fight them overseas there and not have to worry about them here at home, and to prevent a larger war in Europe. Look, at the end of the day, if there is a larger conflict in Europe and we have to get involved because of that, that's going to cost us a lot more money and a lot more troops than what we're spending now. Now, there's debates about how much and when and how, but I can guarantee you if we end up in a third world war, it's going to be a lot more costly in lives and treasure than anything we spend today pushing Russia out of Ukraine. And by the way, we're fighting this war on the cheap. We're taking out a lot of Russian equipment and military without U.S. troops being at stake. That's a net win for us when we're talking about the larger Russia, China, Iran, North Korea alliance taking place.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll give it back to these fine individuals.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I'd love to step in for Kathy. Can I?
Sure.
Kathy, can I step in for two quick? Okay. I think it's worthy of note that as I'm marinating on this, is that this Budapest memorandum, didn't you say, Mr. Jaffer, that Russia agreed to honor the integrity of Ukraine in
They
that
did.
memorandum?
They did, as part of Ukraine agreeing to hand back. So you're right. These were Russian
Okay.
nuclear weapons,
Yeah.
but they were sitting on Ukraine's soil. When it declared independence, it had physical control over them. Russia wanted those weapons back. And so they said, look, we will agree with all you other Western nations to protect Ukraine's territorial integrity if they give us these weapons back. That was the deal. And Russia violated it not once, but twice, back in 2014 when they invaded Crimea, and then again in 2022.
I think that's a really interesting tidbit information. It's not even a tidbit. It's really, really important that none of us really know. I haven't heard that. And then lastly, and then I had to toss it back, so like 20 seconds. It seems to me, would it have been more powerful if it had been an actual treaty?
Oh, absolutely. The treaties are much more powerful.
Okay.
But, presidents oftentimes know they can't get it through, and that's why they don't submit as treaties. Like the Iran nuclear deal.
But I mean, if we made it a treaty, I think that maybe Russia might have had to think a little bit twice, other than this little memorandum, which is another reason to just make sure things are treaties and they're taken more seriously.
I think that's
that
true.
one, I think Congress would have really approved that. I don't think that would have had a lot of pushback.
Yeah, I think it shows that there's
Go
real
ahead,
political alignment between the Senate and the president when you act as a treaty. That's why treaties are so much more powerful. They demonstrate a consensus in that country.
Interesting. Or there's an international treaty, since other nations were a part of it. Every country has to really. Anyway, okay, I'm tossing it back. But I think the fact that Russia has violated their own treaty, so to speak, is interesting. Okay, Kathy, thanks for letting me barge in for a second.
Sure. And we want to welcome our classroom teachers and students who are watching with us today. We have Lizette Flores with Grace and Faith Academy with students. James Klinger, 18 students are watching at Western Kentucky University. Pete Schleicher with students from Big Pine High. And D'Angela Hines with students from Emerald Coast Christian Academy. So welcome to all the teachers and students. If you're a teacher or student watching and we didn't give you a shout out, type it in the Q&A and we'll try to get to you before the end of the program. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV airs these podcasts Monday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to all our listeners in Las Vegas. Now, one of our teachers who is listening, Pete Schleicher, did have a question. Pete points out Vietnam and Korean wars were worth over 50,000 lives. He's asking that as a question. Should our goal be to protect our country?
Look, obviously the loss of life in Korea and Vietnam was dramatic and hugely problematic. One only has to go down to the Vietnam War Memorial here, down by the Lincoln Memorial, and just see the hundreds and thousands of names on that wall. It's stark and deeply disturbing. It's hard to debate or to know, looking back in history with hindsight being 2020, whether Vietnam was the right war or the wrong war, and whether Korea was the right war or the wrong war, whether we prosecuted them the right way, whether we should have gotten authorization in a more formal way and declared war, whether the draft was the right thing to do, whether our interventions in Laos and Cambodia were appropriate. I think you have to put yourself in the shoes of the people who were making those decisions at the time and say, at the time, based on what you knew then, right, was it the right decision? You might say the same thing about Iraq. A lot of people have criticisms about President Bush for going to Iraq, right? Was it the right thing to do the first time? What about the second time when we thought they had weapons of mass destruction, right? Monday morning quarterback in hindsight is always 2020. But the fact of the matter is that America should always defend its national interests when they're at stake. We are safer when we fight the enemy overseas than when we fight them at home. America is safer when we lead in the world, when we bring people to our cause and we fight them jointly with our allies. And we're safer, frankly, when our adversaries are scared of us and our allies know that we have their back. It's a more dangerous world when our adversaries think they can push America around, because they then have a tendency to push us harder and harder. It's why you see the Iranians striking at us. It's why you see Hamas attacking our friends in Israel. It's why you see the Chinese making eyes at Taiwan. It's because they think America is weak and is afraid of our own power. And that's when the world gets dangerous. And that's when we get drawn into conflicts, when we're not strong, we're not forward-leaning. when our adversaries know that we're there, we'll defend ourselves. That's when they're least likely to come after us.
And I think that one thing that may just be missed there is that in all these conflicts that we mentioned, we had multiple political winds shift during the conflicts, and going
Yes.
into them and how we got out of them are two very
That's right.
different topics that really should be studied and looked at and understood. That we didn't go in and out with the same intention. And in a military operation, I don't think we will ever find an example of that being successful. And the loss of life is always terrible, but it would not have been to that extent had the war been executed with a more clearer objective.
Great point.
Good point. Now, Robert Zimmerman asks, do you feel there will ever be any restraint on any government, much less ours, to wage a war as long as there is fiat currencies throughout the world? Economic restraint on waging war seems limited in this light.
Look, I mean, fiat currency is a topic of much debate. We've had a fiat currency that is a dollar that's only backed not by gold, but by the promise of the government for now, the better part of nearly 100 years in this country. I think it's less about fiat currency and more about political systems and political constraints, because at the end of the day, Congress could say no. Right? Congress would say, we're not going to fund this conflict. We're getting you out. And in fact, it was the threat that Congress made back during the Vietnam War that actually ultimately led us to pull out of that war and end that conflict. It was clear that the political tide, to Jules' point, had turned and that conflict had to come to a close. It's also, by the way, why we're now largely out of Afghanistan, right? The political tides have turned. Two presidents in a row, President Trump and President Biden, have said we need to get out. President Bush actually said it as well. And ultimately, Congress made it clear it was time to get out of Afghanistan. Now, the way we left, obviously catastrophic and disastrous, and we abandoned 30,000 of our allies who defended us on the battlefield, stood shoulder to shoulder with our men and women in arms there in Afghanistan. We left them on the battlefield there to be subject to the Taliban's hands. That was not right. But it was clear that politically we had to get out. And so Congress has some power here. It's about holding our elected representatives accountable and them holding the president accountable. We haven't seen enough of that over the last 15, 20 years. More that benefits the nation and our people.
Well, thank you.
How?
Janine, did you
want
to
hold them accountable?
How? Yeah. What is the
Yeah.
My new favorite word is how. I mean, it's like I keep hearing about the border and all the problems. I'm like, how are you going to fix it? When you say how they should have held them accountable, sorry, Kathy, for stepping in. How would they hold them? How should Congress hold them accountable?
Janine, it's a great question. Let's start by talking about how the American people can hold everyone accountable, right? And that's by the most direct form we have, which is voting, right? Too many people in the United States today don't vote. Of the eligible voters in our country, only half of eligible voters are actually registered to vote. And then, Janine, only half of them actually vote. So you have a quarter of the eligible voters in the country deciding, and then half of them plus one deciding who leads our country as president, who the nominee, by the way, and it's even less in primaries. Forget general elections. We have primaries coming up literally this next week in Iowa. We have a caucus. We have primaries in New Hampshire for the Republican Party, at least in the following week, right? People don't vote and get active. You want to hold people accountable? Get out there, educate yourself, and vote. That's number one. And then when your representatives don't do what you want, kick them out. You have the power. Every single student on this thing, when they turn 18, has the right to be an elector, a right to vote. They have a right to get involved in their party conventions, whether in the primaries or in the generals, right? The problem is America, our young people, and frankly, our old people too, have a lot of concerns, but won't get out there and advocate, won't get out there and vote. They'll complain at home at Thanksgiving dinner, but they won't vote. And they won't hold their elected representatives accountable just because they've been in office for 10 years. Doesn't matter. They're not doing what you like. Kick him out. You don't like the president? Put somebody else in office. That is the answer. We need leaders who are held accountable. And unfortunately, we've gotten too used to complaining on Twitter and not voting.
But what should Congress do in this situation? For what should we be asking them to do?
Congress can pull funding. Congress can put laws in place that say no. And by the way, Congress can make laws over a presidential veto. You just have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. The problem is you got to convince that many people, probably of both parties, to do that. And, at times, look, the War Powers Resolution signed over a presidential veto. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act signed over a presidential veto. Congress has constrained the president time after time after time but they have to be willing to stand up, and the American people have to be behind them. And in order to do that, they have to be held accountable at the ballot box. And too many members of Congress are in safe seats and think they can have those seats for as long as they want, and people won't take them out. They need to be taken out of office if they're not doing what you want them to do.
Well, that's a really good point. Go ahead, Kathy. I couldn't resist.
Yeah, and we have so many audience questions. We've got a few people in the audience are asking about China. Lawson Barclay, who happens to be, by the way, one of our best senior essay winners. We remind all of our senior, and we loosely define senior citizen as 55 and older, which, you know, I don't think even 65 is senior citizen, but Lawson won our best senior essay contest. So anyone who's 55 and older, be sure and check that contest out on our website. But Lawson asks, how does the support or lack of support for Ukraine impact the problems with China in the Pacific? Is the Ukraine war draining resources that need to be ready for possible China conflict? And then along those same lines, Gosh asked, you stated China will probably go to war versus Taiwan. How is the U.S. likely to react to this?
Yeah. Well, these are great questions. You know, I am very worried about China as a rising superpower, as a global threat to the United States and our allies around the globe, and in particular to our friends in Taiwan. U.S. policy, unfortunately, since the Nixon administration, has been that we recognize Taiwan as part of China. But the truth is, we've always had the Taiwan Relations Act. We've always provided funding and support to Taiwan as a separate entity, even though notionally we accept Taiwan as part of China. So I think that this question of how much resource are we drawing down, whether it's the conflict in Israel, between Israel and Hamas, or the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, is that drawing attention, resources, capability away from a potential conflict in China? I think the answer is there's no doubt. At the end of the day, it's a world of constrained resources. You got to pick one or two. But I believe that the U.S. can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we have the resources necessary to fight a conflict and help our allies win a conflict in Europe or in the Middle East and in Asia. I don't think we have to pick between the two, but to say that it doesn't detract from it, I think that would be blinkered and not be accurate. So the answer is yes at some level, but I believe the U.S. can and will, as a global superpower, fight multiple conflicts if it needs to, and our adversaries should know that we will defend our interests wherever they are in the globe. We don't need to worry about not being able to do one thing over here because we have to do this other thing over here.
Well, thank you. Now, Bill Koeneke says, prior to the Russian invasion, grain accounted for over 40% of Ukraine's exports. If Russia retains control of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, they effectively control Ukraine's economy and can destroy it by denying them access to sea transport. Shipping grain by rail through Western Europe is not economically viable. This leaves Ukraine with only two options: either fight to regain their lost territories or surrender and once again become a puppet state of Russia. If the latter happens, what will keep Russia from violating yet another agreement by placing troops and nuclear weapons next to NATO's partners, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, and Hungary?
Unfortunately, I think the question is exactly right. And the answer is nothing would stop them from doing that. And frankly, nothing would stop them probably from not even placing troops there, but crossing the border and trying to take even more land. Look, I like to analogize this to like the bully on the playground. We always tell our kids, and we tell our high school kids, I've got a 14-year-old, hey, look, if a bully threatens you on the playground, don't fight with them. Tell the teacher. He or she will talk to us. We'll have a conversation with the parents. We'll sort it out. The truth is, the better advice to give your kids don't listen to this, right? Is, you know what? You want to stop that bully on the playground? Punch the bully in the face in front of everybody, and guess what? They won't mess with you anymore. The same is even more true in the international environment. Countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea understand one thing, and that's power. And the reason why they're doing what they're doing in Europe, the reason why they're doing what they're doing in Israel, and the reason what they're doing in Taiwan is because they don't see America as powerful and willing to stand by our allies and fight against our adversaries. The more we show strength, the less likely they are to threaten us and our friends.
Well, thank you. We have a nice comment here from Robert Zimmerman. He says, terrific conversation. He's so correct on the power of the vote that the young kids need to hear. So thank you for that. And let's see. John,
can I say one additional thing in addition to that? Sure. It's not just vote, by the way. Run for office, whether that's in your town, your city, your county, your state. You can lead. And you can lead, by the way, at an early age. My friend Mike Gallagher is now in Congress. He ran for Congress. He's now the chair of the China Select Committee. I remember when he was a young Marine, just out of his military service. You can be in office and you can make these decisions. You don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. You can and should do it. This is your country. You should fight for it.
So great. That's wonderful. John McFarland asked, what is the United States obligation under Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Now, I don't know what Article 5 is, but do you?
Article 5 of the NATO treaty provides that if a NATO member is attacked, that all NATO members, the United States included, but all the other NATO members too, will treat it as an attack against all of them. And so they'll respond with military force. So an attack on one is an attack on all. Think of it like the Three Musketeers. It's a binding treaty commitment. It's only been exercised once, and that was after the 9/11 attacks on the United States by Al-Qaeda. All the NATO members said an attack on one is an attack on all. It's why NATO fought alongside us in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, because they invoked Article 5 of the NATO treaty.
Well, thank you. And we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I want to go back to Janine for one more question.
I can't help myself today. You're so interesting, Mr. Jaffer. But I do want to ask you, because it's all over the news, and there's all this talk about if a nuclear weapon is launched, and you would know the answer to this, we only have, I don't know what, 15 minutes, 15 seconds, surely more than 15 seconds, 15 minutes to respond. So A, but B, with Secretary of Defense Austin and nobody knowing where he was, completely out of touch for what? I mean, 3 days, 7 days, pick your pick, 10 days. What is protocol? And then you hear a congressman coming on and saying, you only have 15 minutes to respond to a nuclear weapon coming over, which now supposedly Iran has, and all this. So how, and we're not supposed to know where anybody is? I mean, it's like, oh wait, where's the Secretary of Defense? What is protocol for that?
It's funny, Shasette, I was just on Fox Business this morning talking about this exact issue, and Congressman Mike Waltz, a friend of mine as well, who also served in the Army, laid out this 15-minute situation. The protocol is the Secretary of Defense is supposed to tell everybody when he's out of pocket, or his staff is supposed to tell everybody. They're supposed to transfer the authorities to the Deputy Secretary of Defense or the next person down, and then they act as the Secretary of Defense. Unfortunately, what happened here was Secretary Austin and his team didn't tell anybody. They didn't even tell the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who was given some authorities. She was on vacation in Puerto Rico, took on those authorities, probably should have come back, frankly, didn't. But didn't know why. She didn't know he was in the hospital. And then the President of the United States, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, didn't know. I mean, it is crazy. And the idea that during the same time frame, by the way, we issued an ultimatum to the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. We conducted an airstrike against a militant in Baghdad who had been attacking Americans in Iraq and Syria, leading those attacks. And we have a war going on in the Middle East. We have a war going on in Europe that we're helping fund, and a potential conflict in Taiwan. And the Secretary of Defense in the hospital for 4 days and nobody knows? What? It's crazy.
Well, and also, as you said, we do have troops in harm's way right now, our Navy, in these waters. Well, I mean, is there a scenario where something should, like, let's just say he was unconscious. We don't know, right? But he's unconscious. He's loaded up in should the wife? Is it the wife? Whoever's near him responsibility to call? I mean, what if he doesn't have a staff member around him at all times?
Well, first of all, the Secretary of Defense has a whole group of people that travels with, right? He's got security. He's got his junior military aide was there with him at the hospital. And apparently they told the chief of staff.
Oh, okay.
It took about a day, but they told their chief of staff, his chief of staff, she apparently had the flu, didn't tell anybody. I mean, like, it just seems like crazy chaos. And what it demonstrates, though, is that the administration, as chaotic as they said the prior administration was, they have their own form of chaos. Neither one particularly effective in the way they operated. And this is not the way to run a government, right? The Biden administration, when it was elected, said, you're getting the adults in the room. Well, apparently, as compared to the prior administration, in their view, apparently not so much on either side. And, this is exactly why we need leaders who have been tested before, who've been leaders in other places. Elections are coming up, folks. Pay attention to your primaries. Pay attention to the general election. This is your time to cast your vote for people who are going to lead our country, whether in Congress, in the House, the Senate, or your local government, as well as the presidency.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, and our enemies really love that. Oh, look, America! We didn't even know where he was, and this look what we can accomplish. Not very good for the enemies to see that.
That's right.
Okay, I'll send it. Thank you, Mr. Jaffer. So wonderful. And to all of our fabulous host team. And Kathy, I'll toss it to you for closing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for all your great questions. And we hope you'll join us next week, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about the Constitution and Israel. We look forward to seeing y'all all back then. And thank you, Jamil. What a great hour. It went by so fast. We could probably do another hour. So
Thanks for having me.
thank you. Tthank you so much.
Bye now.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye.